The moment I understood my son no longer saw me as his mother, only as a problem waiting to be solved. I was standing in his kitchen holding a casserole dish nobody had asked me to bring, listening to a room full of laughter that had nothing to do with me. I set the dish on the counter quietly. Nobody turned around. That was Christmas Eve. And before the night ended, I would walk out of my son Martin's house, carrying nothing but my coat, and a truth I could no longer pretend wasn't there. But to understand why I left, you need to understand what I almost lost before I realized it was already gone. My husband Howard passed away 4 years before that Christmas. A heart attack on a Wednesday morning in early March, so ordinary and sudden it still felt impossible. 41 years of marriage ended between breakfast and noon. I remember standing in the hospital hallway afterward, thinking someone should have warned me. Someone should have told me that the person who made ordinary life feel extraordinary could simply stop one day, and the world would keep moving anyway. Howard had been a quiet man. He fixed things, not just objects, the broken latch on a neighbor's fence, the wobbly chair leg in our dining room, but situations. When our son Martin was struggling in his 20s, Howard sat with him for hours without judgment. When our daughter-in-law Colette became difficult during the early years of their marriage, Howard always found the charitable explanation, the patient word. He saw people generously. It was his greatest gift, and, I sometimes think, the thing I miss most. After he died, I expected grief. I did not expect to become invisible. At first, Martin called regularly. Weekly, then every 2 weeks, then once a month, then whenever he happened to remember. Colette's calls stopped almost entirely within the first year. I made excuses for both of them. They were busy. They had the children. They had a life I shouldn't burden with my sadness. I believed that for a long time. Longer than I should have. Martin and Colette lived about 40 minutes from me in a large house outside of Indianapolis. They had 2 children, my grandson Oliver, who was 16, and my granddaughter June, who was 13. June had Howard's eyes. Every time I saw her, I had to remind myself not to stare. By the 3rd Christmas after Howard died, I noticed a pattern. Family gatherings increasingly revolved around Colette's side of the family. Her parents, her brother, his wife, and children. I was always invited. I was never exactly included. There's a difference between those two things that most people only understand once they've felt it. The 4th Christmas. I arrived at Martin's house carrying a baked ham, 2 pies I'd made from scratch, and a warmth I had spent the entire drive convincing myself was justified. Hope is a stubborn thing. Even when experience argues against it, it keeps returning small and persistent, like a pilot light that refuses to go out. I should have listened to experience. Martin opened the door. Hi, Mom. He kissed my cheek in that brief way that feels more like a checkbox than affection. Come on in. Everyone's here. Everyone was right. Colette's parents were stationed near the fireplace with drinks in hand. Her brother Derek and his wife were occupying the couch. Several cousins whose names I could never quite keep straight were scattered across the living room. Children ran through the hallway. Music played. Candles burned on every surface. It looked like a beautiful Christmas. I carried the ham and pies into the kitchen without being asked. Nobody offered to help. Colette glanced up from arranging a charcuterie board. Oh, Vivian! She used my first name with the particular efficiency of someone checking an item off a list. You didn't have to bring anything. She returned to her board before I could respond. I set the pies beside a store-bought cheesecake and tried not to notice. For the next hour, I drifted. That's the only word that captures it accurately. I moved from room to room searching for a conversation to belong to, a group that might naturally open to include me. Colette's mother, Shirley, held court near the fireplace and spoke exclusively to people she already knew. Derek's wife was pleasant but clearly had no interest in extending herself. Martin was always just leaving the room I entered. Only June found me. She came around the corner of the hallway with her hair slightly messy and a book tucked under her arm, and her face lit up the way Howard's used to. Grandma Vivian. She said it like an announcement. There's my girl. She hugged me properly, the way teenagers rarely hug adults, full and genuine. We sat together on the small bench near the front window and talked about the book she was reading, and whether she still wanted to study marine biology, and how she'd gotten a solo in the school winter concert. It was the best 20 minutes of my evening. Then Colette called her name from the kitchen. June gave me an apologetic look and disappeared. I sat alone on the bench and looked out the window at the dark December street and tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly welcomed in that house. I couldn't. Dinner was called around 7. I followed the sound of chairs being pulled out and found the dining room crowded and warm. I looked for my place at the table. Howard and I had been sitting at Martin and Colette's dinner table since they bought this house 12 years ago. I had always sat at the far end, near the window, where the candlelight was warmest. It was nothing formal, just a consistency that had become, over time, a kind of belonging. That seat held someone else tonight. I scanned the table slowly. Every chair at the main table was occupied. Near the kitchen doorway sat a smaller table, a folding one, the kind pulled from storage for overflow. A child I didn't recognize sat there, and one of Derek's teenagers, and an empty chair. Martin appeared beside me. "Oh, Mom, we're a little crowded this year." He gestured toward the folding table, with the ease of someone who had already decided. This was a reasonable solution. I looked at him for a moment. He was already moving toward his own seat. I sat down at the folding table. I put my napkin in my lap and picked up my fork and told myself it didn't matter. I was 67 years old. I had survived the worst loss of my life. I was not going to cry about a chair. But it wasn't about the chair. It was about what the chair communicated. That I was optional. That my presence could be accommodated or rearranged depending on who else was coming. That after 41 years of marriage into this family, after a lifetime of holidays, after all of it, there wasn't room for me at the table. From where I sat, I could see the main table clearly. Martin laughed at something Derek said. Colette poured wine elegantly and accepted compliments on the table setting. Shirley told a story about a cruise she and her husband had recently taken. June caught my eye once and gave me a small wave. I smiled back. Halfway through dinner, I stood to refill my water glass. As I moved toward the kitchen, I heard voices from the hallway near Martin's home office. The door was half open. I wasn't trying to listen. Martin's voice came through first. "If we time it right, it won't be an issue." Then Colette. "We've already waited too long, honestly." Martin again. "She's not going to fight it. She never fights anything." I stopped breathing. Colette's voice lowered. "That's what worries me. When she eventually figures it out, she'll be devastated." Martin sighed. "That's why we don't tell her until it's done." I stood in the hallway with my empty glass and a cold, spreading feeling in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. Tell her what? Done what? But the conversation shifted, and footsteps approached the door, and I moved quickly toward the kitchen before either of them emerged. For the rest of dinner, I smiled. I accepted a slice of ham someone had finally transferred to the main table. I answered the few questions directed my way, and all the while, my mind kept returning to those words. She's not going to fight it. What was there to fight? By 9 o'clock, guests were gathering coats and saying their goodbyes. The room began emptying with that particular Christmas Eve momentum. Children growing sleepy, early risers, remembering morning plans. I waited, thinking perhaps there would be a quiet moment, a cup of tea, a conversation that felt like family. It didn't come. Martin walked 2 of Derek's cousins to the door and got swept into a long goodbye conversation near the porch. Colette was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher with focused efficiency. Nobody looked my way. I stood in the middle of the living room for a moment. Just stood there, in the warm candlelight, surrounded by the remnants of a Christmas Eve gathering, and realized with a quiet, devastating clarity that I could leave, and it would take hours before anyone noticed. So I did. I got my coat from the hall closet. I picked up my purse. I took one last look at the room, at the photographs on the mantel, at June's school portrait near the bookcase, at a framed picture of Howard taken years ago at a family reunion, still smiling from someone else's shelf. I opened the front door and stepped into the cold. Nobody called after me. I sat in my car for several minutes in Martin's driveway and watched the warm light glow from the windows. From outside, it looked exactly like Christmas was supposed to look. Then I started the engine and drove. I wasn't sure where I was going at first. The highway opened ahead of me, and I simply kept moving, putting distance between myself and the candles and the folding table, and the half-heard conversation I couldn't unhear. She's not going to fight it. 20 miles down the interstate, a name came to mind. Theodore Marsh. Howard had known Theodore for over 30 years. They had worked together briefly in their 40s, stayed close long after their professional paths diverged. Theodore was a financial planner, the methodical and careful kind, and Howard had trusted him the way some people trust a doctor or a minister. Not because he had to, but because Theodore had earned it slowly over decades. Theodore had called me once, about 8 months after Howard's funeral, not with paperwork or business, just to say that Howard had made some arrangements he wanted me to understand when I was ready. I had thanked him and said, perhaps later. I was still barely leaving the house that month. Later had arrived, and I hadn't followed up. Now, driving in the dark on Christmas Eve, I wondered whether I should have called sooner. I found an exit and pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and searched for Theodore's number. It was late, it was a holiday. He almost certainly wouldn't answer. He answered on the third ring, Vivian. His voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who had lived long enough to understand that calls at strange hours mean something. Theodore. I'm sorry for the hour. Don't be. A brief pause. Are you all right? I'm not sure. I said it plainly, because it was true. I heard something tonight at Martin's, something I don't understand, and I don't know who else to call. He was quiet for a moment. Then, where are you right now? I told him. Go home and get some sleep if you can. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9. I'll be there. I almost said it's Christmas. Instead, I said, thank you, Theodore. I drove home through the quiet dark. The house felt emptier than usual, which was saying something, because it had been feeling empty for 4 years. I made tea I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the magnet Howard had put on the refrigerator years ago. A cartoon duck holding an umbrella with the words, "It'll all work out," in faded yellow letters. He had meant it ironically. We had both laughed at it. Somehow it had stayed. I went to bed at midnight and stared at the ceiling and thought about the words "she's not going to fight it" on a loop until exhaustion finally took over. Theodore Marsh's office occupied a quiet suite on the second floor of a brick building near downtown Indianapolis. Christmas morning. The parking lot was empty. He was already inside. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. More silver in his hair, more weight behind his eyes, but the steadiness was unchanged. He shook my hand the way people do when they actually mean it. Sit down, Vivian. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Tell me what you heard. I told him everything. The folding table, the half-heard conversation, the words about timing and telling me when it was done. He listened without interrupting, his face still and careful, the way Howard's used to look when something genuinely concerned him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was afraid something like this might come. The air in the room changed immediately. What do you mean? He opened his desk drawer and removed a folder, then placed it between us. This isn't what I wanted to discuss on Christmas morning. He looked at me directly. But you came, so I'll tell you the truth. Please. He folded his hands. Before Howard died, he made some very specific decisions about your estate. I waited. He knew, Theodore said quietly. He didn't tell you because he didn't want to worry you and because he hoped he was wrong. He knew that Martin had started asking questions. What kind of questions? He tapped the folder. About the house, your house. About Howard's investments. About ownership. About who controlled what after Howard was gone. The word ownership sat in my chest like a stone. Martin was asking those questions while Howard was still alive. Theodore nodded. For about 2 years before his death, Howard noticed. He didn't confront Martin because that wasn't his way. Instead, he made quiet adjustments. What adjustments? Theodore opened the folder. He transferred full ownership of your home into your name alone. Not the estate, not a joint trust. Yours entirely. I have those records here. I stared at the document. I remembered signing papers at some point during that period. Howard had explained something about estate planning. I had trusted him and not asked enough questions. The same way I had always trusted him and not asked enough questions. Your home is yours, Theodore continued. Completely. Nobody can initiate a sale or transfer without your signature. I exhaled. He also established investment protections, multiple authorization requirements for any significant transaction. He wanted to make sure that if anyone ever pressured you, the legal architecture wouldn't allow them to move quickly. The word pressured. How careful he had been with his word choices. Why didn't he tell me? Theodore looked at me with the quiet sadness of someone delivering news they've been carrying for a long time. He said he didn't want you to spend whatever years you had left being suspicious of your own son. He wanted you to be able to love Martin without fear. The thing about grief is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, at unexpected moments, triggered by the most ordinary things. Theodore's words hit me like one of those waves, not because they hurt, because they sounded exactly like Howard. Patient, protective, quietly heartbroken. A tear moved down my face. I wiped it away. Is there more? Theodore hesitated. Then he reached for a second folder. There is a letter. I stopped breathing. He left it with me 3 years before his death. He said to give it to you if you ever came to me with concerns about the family. He slid the envelope across the desk. My name was on the front in Howard's handwriting. Small, slightly slanted, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards for 40 years. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. Dear Vivian, if you're reading this, something happened that I hoped wouldn't. I want you to know first that none of it is your fault. You have always loved our family more than they deserved, and that isn't a weakness. It's who you are. But love without protection can be exploited by people who mistake generosity for permission. Martin is my son, and I love him. I also know him. I've watched him change over the years, watched him become someone whose first question in any situation is, what does this mean for me? That didn't happen overnight, and Colette didn't create it alone. But she accelerated it. I've done what I can legally to protect what we built together. Theodore knows everything. Trust him completely. Most importantly, trust yourself. You are not confused. You are not declining. You are not a problem to be managed. You are the woman I chose to spend my life with, and that means something. Even now. Especially now. Don't let anyone decide your future without your full knowledge and consent. Not our son. Not anyone. All my love. Always. Howard. I sat with the letter for a long time. Theodore didn't rush me. The office was quiet. Outside, Christmas morning traffic was occasional and distant. Finally, I looked up. He anticipated all of this. Theodore nodded softly. He loved you very much, yes. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He did. The next several days felt like learning to read a language I had always spoken but never formally studied. Theodore walked me through documents I had never fully examined. Property records, investment structures, beneficiary designations. Things Howard had quietly organized, while I was focused on keeping daily life running, which is what I had always done, and which had left me largely unaware of our financial architecture until now. The picture that emerged was both reassuring and disturbing. Reassuring because Howard had built real protections, disturbing because those protections had been necessary. On the third day, Theodore introduced me to a colleague named Patricia Wells, an attorney who specialized in elder law and estate planning. Patricia was composed and direct in a way I immediately respected. She reviewed the documents Theodore had assembled and spent an hour asking me careful questions. At the end of that hour, she said, "Your husband did thorough work. You're well protected legally. But?" She looked at me evenly. But protection only works if you use it. If someone presents you with documents and pressures you to sign, the protection means nothing if you don't know to refuse. I understood. Has anyone presented you with documents recently? I thought about it. Not documents, but a folder. At Christmas dinner, I had noticed a folder on the desk in Martin's office, blue, partially open. I had mentioned it briefly to Theodore but hadn't thought much about it since. I mentioned it now. Patricia made a note. Can you describe it in more detail? I described what I had seen. She nodded slowly. I'd like to make some inquiries. Please, she did. I don't know exactly how, and I didn't ask. What I learned 3 days later was enough to answer several questions I hadn't known to ask. The folder contained preliminary documents related to a property transaction. My property. A transaction that had not been discussed with me, had not been authorized by me, and could not legally move forward without my signature, but had apparently been drafted under the assumption that obtaining that signature would be a manageable formality. I sat across from Patricia in Theodore's conference room and let that settle. They had been planning this for how long? Patricia answered calmly. Based on what we've found, conversations began approximately 10 months ago. 10 months. My Christmas ham was still in Martin's refrigerator. I had not received a single call in the days since I'd left, not one. That fact arrived slowly, the way the worst facts usually do, not as a shock but as a confirmation. That evening, my phone finally rang. Martin. I looked at his name on the screen and remembered the last time I'd seen him. He had been walking two of Derek's cousins to the door. He hadn't looked back. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. Then Colette. Then Martin once more. The messages arrived in stages. First casual. Mom, just checking in. Call me when you get a chance. Then slightly less casual. Hey, haven't heard from you. Give me a call. Then something closer to urgency. Mom, we should talk. It's important. Important. Not I miss you. Not I'm sorry you left without saying goodbye. Important. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. I listened to all three messages and then set my phone face down on Theodore's conference table. Patricia looked at me. You don't have to respond yet. I know. She gathered some paperwork. There's something else you should see. The something else turned out to be a pattern of financial activity. Several transfers, modest individually, significant collectively, originating from a joint account Howard and I had maintained for household purposes. An account I had barely touched in years. An account to which Martin, at some point during a period I couldn't precisely identify, had been added as an authorized user. When was that added? Patricia showed me the date. About 3 years ago. I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered that conversation. Martin had mentioned something about helping with bills while Howard was ill. I had agreed, in that distracted, grief-adjacent way you agree to things when you're watching your husband disappear by degrees. I hadn't thought about it since. What had been moved? Patricia laid the records in front of me. Not enormous amounts. Enough to matter. Enough to suggest a pattern. I removed his access the next morning. My phone kept ringing. Martin, then Colette. One evening, a call I didn't recognize from a number that turned out to be Colette's brother Derek, which I found particularly interesting. Then, on the 5th day, June called. Grandma Vivian. Her voice was small in a way that told me she'd been upset for a while. Hi, sweetheart. Are you okay? She said it the way teenagers say it when they've been worrying and don't know how to ask. Where are you? I'm home. I'm fine. Mom and Dad have been fighting. I kept my voice steady. About what? She hesitated. I think about you. She paused, and about money. There was another silence, the kind that means someone is deciding how much to say. Dad keeps saying everything got complicated. Complicated. Another carefully managed word. June, I said. Has anyone asked you about me? A beat. Not directly. She said it carefully, the way a perceptive 13-year-old navigates a room full of adults. But I've heard things. What kinds of things? Another hesitation. She said slowly. Dad told Mom that Grandma just needs to sign a few things, and then it'll be settled. I put the phone down briefly, just for a second, and looked at Howard's photograph on my bookshelf. Then I picked it back up. June, have you heard that conversation before? More than once? She was quiet. A few times. I thought for a moment. Then I asked, do you have a way to let me know if something important comes up? You mean like tell you? Yes, just between us. If you hear something you think I should know. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Grandma, I already took a video. I went very still. What kind of video? She lowered her voice to nearly a whisper. Last week. Before Christmas. Dad and Derek were in the office and I was in the hallway. I had my phone out for something else. It was recording when they started talking. June. I know. She sounded both guilty and resolved. I didn't mean to. But then I listened back and I didn't know what to do with it. Is it still on your phone? Yes. Can you send it to me? Already sent. I smiled despite everything. You have your grandfather's timing. She laughed softly. I hope so. The video arrived within minutes. 43 seconds of slightly shaky footage, the camera mostly pointed at the floor, 2 voices unmistakable. Derek first. She's going to push back eventually. Martin. Not if we move before she realizes the full picture. A pause. Derek again. What's the timeline now? Martin. Quieter. We just need the authorization page. Everything else is ready. Then Colette's voice from further away, just audible. Will she just sign it if you ask her? Martin's response. Low and flat. She always signs things when I explain them right. The recording ended. I listened to it 3 times. Then I sent it to Patricia. She called me back within the hour. Her voice was steady, but I knew her well enough by then to recognize when steadiness was being deliberately maintained. This changes things considerably. Yes, I said. I imagined it would. The meeting took place 9 days after Christmas. Theodore's conference room, same polished table, same quiet efficiency. Patricia sat beside me. Martin and Colette arrived together. Derek had been asked to come as well, which had apparently surprised him. Martin looked tired. He also looked, for just a moment when he first saw Patricia, afraid. Good. I had spent years, I realized, being the one who was afraid. Afraid to say too much. Afraid to push too hard. Afraid to be the difficult mother, the inconvenient elder, the woman who expected too much from children who were busy living their lives. That morning, sitting across from my son with Howard's letter folded in my purse, I was not afraid. Theodore opened the meeting by placing several documents on the table. Property records, financial records, the timeline of account access. He was calm and thorough the way he had always been. Martin's jaw tightened as each page appeared. Colette looked at the table. Derek looked at the wall. I waited until Theodore had finished. Then I spoke. I'd like to ask a question. Martin looked up. Mom, one question first. My voice was level. When did you decide that my home was part of your financial planning? He didn't answer immediately. Colette shifted in her chair. Martin finally said, It's not like that. No? I slid the property documents toward him. Because this suggests it's very much like that. He looked down. We were just exploring options. Options for whom? More silence. Patricia placed the recording's transcript on the table. She didn't play the audio. She simply put the transcript where everyone could see it. The color left Martin's face. Colette closed her eyes briefly. Derek picked up the pages, read the first paragraph, and set them down again. I looked at my son. He was 53 years old. He had Howard's chin and my stubbornness, and somewhere underneath all of it, the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder, watching Sunday afternoon movies. That boy was still in there. I believed that. But he had made choices, accumulated them over years, convinced himself at each step that what he was doing was reasonable, temporary, justifiable. Martin, I said. Did you ever ask me what I wanted? He stared at the table. Did you ask whether I wanted to sell my house? Whether I'd considered moving? Whether I needed help managing anything? His silence was its own answer. Colette surprised me, she said quietly. I told him we should talk to you. Martin looked at her sharply. She met his gaze. I did, twice. The room was very still. I looked at Colette. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard her say. I didn't know what to do with it yet, but I held it carefully. Then I looked at Derek. He was the piece that puzzled me most. A brother-in-law I barely knew involved in conversations about my property. Derek shifted. Look, you were invited into a private discussion about my finances without my knowledge. I kept my voice even. I'd like to understand why. He had no answer that fit comfortably in the room. Patricia took over the procedural matters then. Authorization changes, account reviews, legal documentation. All the careful machinery of protection being made explicit. I watched Martin's face as each item was explained. The early defensiveness gave way, slowly, to something that might have been shame. By the end of the meeting, the plan, whatever it had been, however detailed, was gone. Not dramatically, not with shouting, just dismantled, quietly and thoroughly in a conference room on a cold December afternoon. When it was over, Martin and Colette and Derek put on their coats in silence. Derek left first without meeting my eyes. Martin stopped near the door. He stood there for a moment with his back half turned. I waited. He turned around. His face looked like something in it had broken recently, and the pieces hadn't settled yet. Dad would be ashamed of me. I looked at my son. The truest thing he'd said all day. Yes, I said, he would. Martin nodded once, then walked out. Colette lingered. She looked at me with an expression that was complicated in ways I didn't fully understand. Then she said quietly, I'm sorry, Vivian. I didn't know yet whether I believed it. But I heard it. Thank you, I said. And I meant it. The weeks after the meeting were quiet in the way that follows a significant storm. Not peaceful exactly. Just still. The debris was everywhere. You just couldn't hear the wind anymore. I made a decision during that stillness that I'd been considering for longer than I realized. I moved. Not far, not dramatically, not in the breathless way of someone running. I had spent a long time thinking about a small town in Tennessee that Howard and I had visited twice on drives south. A town built around a river and some old trees and a pace of life that felt like something I'd been meaning to return to for 20 years. I called a real estate agent in January. By April, I was there. My new house was modest and floored in worn pine, and had a back porch facing a tree line that turned spectacular in the fall. I planted a garden that first spring, badly, and learned from it. I joined a church not because I was particularly devout, but because the choir needed an alto, and it had been 30 years since I'd sung in one, and some things deserved to be reclaimed. I made friends the way adults don't expect to anymore. Slowly and with some awkwardness, and then suddenly, completely. A woman named Beverly, who lived 2 streets over, and made the best pound cake I'd ever tasted, and never asked personal questions until she knew you well enough to mean them. A retired nurse named Agatha who had outlived 2 husbands, and had opinions about everything, and was absolutely right about most of it. I had not known how much I needed people who simply liked me. Not because of what I could give or provide or sign, but because of who I actually was, which turned out, in the right company, to be someone worth knowing. June visited in the summer. She slept in the small guest room with its quilt I'd found at an estate sale, and declared it the best room she'd ever slept in, which was the highest compliment she possessed. We walked along the river trail in the mornings and talked about everything. She wanted to study ecology now, not marine biology. Howard would have loved that. On the last morning of her visit, she sat at my kitchen table, drinking orange juice, and watching me make eggs, and she said, without any particular preamble, "I want to be like you when I get older." I turned around. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, the particular shrug of a teenager trying to say something real without making it awkward, like, "Not afraid." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I wasn't always." "Yeah," she said. "I know. That's kind of the point." Martin called on a Tuesday in September. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just a Tuesday. His voice was different. Not soft exactly, but without the efficient remove I had come to expect from him. Like someone who had put something heavy down and wasn't quite sure what to do with their hands. He asked how I was. He asked about the house and the garden. He asked if June had visited, which she had, which he already knew. But he asked, anyway. We talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't healed. Healing doesn't arrive in a single phone call. But it was honest in a way our conversations hadn't been in years. Maybe longer than I'd admitted to myself. When we said goodbye, he said, "I'm trying, Mom." "I know," I said. "I can tell." Colette called the following week. We had a shorter conversation, but it held more warmth than I expected. Whether that warmth would build into something real would require time and consistency, and I had learned not to evaluate those things prematurely. I was patient. Differently patient than I had been before, though. Not passive, not accommodating. Patient the way a person is when they've decided they're worth waiting for. That first Thanksgiving in Tennessee, I hosted 12 people. Beverly and her husband. Agatha and her youngest son, who drove down from Nashville. 3 neighbors I'd met through the church choir. A couple from the farmer's market, who turned out to have lived 3 miles from me in Indianapolis for a decade, without our ever meeting. Which seemed funny now. I made Howard's mashed potatoes. His recipe card was in a box I'd brought from the old house, handwriting still clear, the card edges soft with years of handling. I touched it the same way I always did. Then I cooked, and I laughed, and I poured too much wine, and I stayed at my own table until 11 o'clock at night, talking about nothing in particular, with people who wanted to be there. Every single chair was the right one. Howard used to say that the life we're meant to have often waits just past the life we've been settling for. He said it about small things usually. Restaurants, vacation plans, the color to repaint the kitchen. He didn't know he was describing something larger. But he usually didn't. He was like that, Howard. Small truths with large applications. I settled into Tennessee the way you settle into something that fits. Without forcing it, without performance, simply by continuing to show up. The garden got better. The choir got used to me. Beverly and I developed the particular shorthand of women's, who have decided they're going to be friends for the rest of their lives, and stopped wasting time on small talk. I turned 69 in the spring and spent the afternoon on my back porch with a book and a glass of iced tea, and nobody requiring anything from me. I thought about the woman who had stood in her son's kitchen on Christmas Eve, holding a casserole dish nobody wanted, waiting for someone to look her way. She felt very far from where I was sitting. Not gone. I didn't believe in erasing the hard seasons. They had made me, as much as anything, into someone who understood what a good table was worth. But far, and the distance felt right. I had spent a long time believing that family was the people you were born to. I believed it so thoroughly that I had let that belief cost me more than I could measure. I still loved my son. I still believed, on the good days, that something was slowly repairing between us. I still hoped June would come back every summer, until she had summers of her own to give. But I had also learned something that nobody had told me, and that I was telling myself now, clearly for the record. The right table isn't always the one you were assigned. Sometimes you have to leave the one that had no room for you and build your own. Set it carefully. Put out the good china. Light every candle. And when the people who actually see you finally sit down, you'll know. Not because it's perfect, because it's real. That's what I had now. And at 69, sitting on a back porch in Tennessee with Howard's handwriting, still on a recipe card in my kitchen drawer, I could say with complete honesty that it was more than enough. It was, finally, exactly right.